quick introduction for those of you that don't know. For those that you do, I'm just going to be repetitive here. I am Evil Nate, professional, independent professional wrestler, the Killbilly, the urban legend, the backwoods buzzsaw. I'm the guy that runs around the independent wrestling scene swinging an Excalibur chainsaw from Texas Chainsaw 3. Anyway, what I'm talking about is Texas Chainsaw Part 1 through 4. Now, imagine this, being a kid growing up and you love this franchise, and before the remake comes out, you're trying to make sense of the timeline of this franchise, because there are things that happen in all 4 movies that are connected, but then there are things that happen and it's like, there's no way that this can be connected. It makes no sense at all. So recently, and when I say recently, I'm talking about for maybe the last month, I had an aha moment. And that aha moment came when I saw a tweet, or an X, whatever you want to call it, from the developers of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre game, which I absolutely love. And it was how Kim Hinkle, the co-writer of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, along with the director, Tobe Hooper, how they're the Slaughters in Texas Chainsaw Massacre 1, and then in Part 2, they're the Sawyers. And how basically what I mean by that is they refer to Leatherface as Bubba in Part 2, and he's only referred to as Leatherface in Part 1, and how they're not the same. And I was like, you know what? There's something to that. This is Evil Nate's Texas Chainsaw Massacre theory, so here we go. It goes like this. Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 1. As I just pointed out, the family is written as the Slaughters. Kim Hinkle has confirmed that. Kim Hinkle co-wrote the film with Tobe Hooper. They are the Slaughters. You have the hitchhiker, who is a brother. You have the cook, who is a brother, we assume. And you have Grandpa, and you have the mummified corpse of Grandma in the attic along with Grandpa, who's barely alive. And then you have Leatherface. This first family in Part 1, they are called the Slaughters. That is their last name. In the very first film, we know the hitchhiker dies, perishes, bam, he's dead. We know the cook survives the first film. We know Grandpa survives the first film. The hitchhiker is the only casualty of the Slaughters. Leatherface is hit with a wrench in his head, and Leatherface falls, and the chainsaw slices into the upper thigh of his right leg, and pretty deep too. Leatherface screams. We watch him limping as he's trying to get to Sally, and the truck driver just keeps on running. Some say he's still running to this day. No. But we watch Leatherface. Now he definitely cannot catch Sally because he just cut into his thigh. So we know Leatherface is wounded in his right leg. All right, then we fast forward to the sequel. After more than 10 years, Tobe Hooper, the director and co-writer of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, gave us Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. Now this is where things start to get fun. Now, when you watch Part 2, you realize Leatherface in the sequel acts completely different than Leatherface in the original film. I mean, he is just like this, and he's like basically like a horny teenager almost. Like he's just obsessed with her, and he's goofy. He's like really goofy. Now, I do realize it's not lost on me. Tobe Hooper came out and said that, and you know, he's quoted as to saying that one thing that irked him about the first film is everybody missed the aspects of the comedy in the first film. And I can see the comedy aspects from Franklin having a bad day in the first film, and that's really the big one too. You know, just like some funny stuff, some interplay with Leatherface and his brothers. So there are funny things, but the tone of that film is just so out of this world. Anyway, so that's why Tobe Hooper went the complete opposite route in the sequel, Texas Chainsaw 2, and basically made a black comedy, as it's referred to. And so there's a lot of goofiness, a lot of silliness in the entire film. But the Leatherface in Part 2, he's fine. His leg is fine. He's not limping at all. He's okay. Okay. Now, in Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, the theory is that the Leatherface in that movie is completely different than the Leatherface in the first one. Now, this Leatherface, he's referred to as Bubba. He's very silly, acts completely different than he did in Part 1. And I have a theory that that could be another one of the brothers or another one of the cousins. And we find out that their name in part 2 is the Sawyers. So they're the Slaughters as they're written in part 1. And it even has it on the gas station, We Slaughter Barbecue, W.E. Slaughter. Keep that in mind. And then they're called the Sawyers in the sequel. Drayton Sawyer, we find out, is the cook. He wins a chili cook-off. So, but then we also find out too, Chop Top, he is the the alleged twin brother of the hitchhiker, which is called Nubbins, from the first one. So that's his twin brother. So there is this relation of the Sawyers and the Slaughters. They're the same family, two different last names, and the inbreeding comes in. Okay, so then we get to where everything happens. To basically, Leatherface gets impaled by Lefty's chainsaw through the guts. We see all his intestines falling out. There's no way he's going to survive that. Absolutely not. He's not supernatural at this point or anything, so he's not surviving that. So he dies. So we know that grandpa passes away, Drayton passes away, and Bubba, who is not the Leatherface from part 1, passes away. They are blown up. Chop Top survives. And we know he survives because after the events of part 2, thanks to Tobe Hooper's son, who was working on All-American Massacre later on in the late 90s, early 2000s, we know that Chop Top was in a mental institution or something like that. He'd been locked up ever since the events of part 2. We move on to part 3. Now, how can we have a part 3 when Leatherface in the last film literally got impaled through the guts, through the stomach, and then got blown up? Well, there's no sign of that wound, of that, at all. So, what is there a sign of? In part 3, they're a completely different family. They're still the Sawyers, so they can be an extended family of the Sawyers in part 2 and the Slaughters in part 1. Keep that in mind. But what does Leatherface have in part 3? He's limping and wearing a knee brace on his right leg that covers his entire leg. That's from the wound in part 1. So Leatherface from part 3 is the same Leatherface from part 1. Now, that's the theory that in part 2 he was a brother or a cousin taking on the mantle of Leatherface, because they even refer to a character named W.E. Sawyer, not W.E. Slaughter, but W.E. Sawyer in the beginning of part 3 that was apprehended. And it was just basically assumed and confirmed that he would become Leatherface whenever he donned a human flesh mask. And then he was put to death in the gas chamber. So W.E. Sawyer could definitely be an unseen member that we had never encountered throughout the franchise thus far. So that tells me that, considering they were blaming somebody else or accusing somebody else of being a Leatherface, that the family of the Slaughters and the Sawyers, they do have a tendency to have different Leatherfaces in their family. And it's some type of tradition, probably predates Grandpa himself. So the Leatherface in part 2 that died is not the Leatherface from part 1, but the Leatherface in part 3, because of how he acts with the leg brace as well, is definitely the same Leatherface from part 1. All right. Now, with that being said, we're introduced to all the Sawyers, Tinker and Tex and Alfredo and Mama, and then there's a little girl that's assumed to be Leatherface's daughter. Okay, so all this can come from more inbreeding and all that stuff. Well, Grandpa that's in part 3, that can be the same Grandpa from part 1, because he is literally now a dead, mummified body. He's done. He's out. So we can say that that is the same Grandpa from part 1 if we want to. Another thing that happens in part 3, when we're following our, I forget, her name is lost on me now, I'll probably put it in here, but when we're following the heroine in the film, and they're stopped, and the cops, they have found another body pit full of like 100 bodies or something like that. Well, before, in the scene, the beginning of the scene, the camera zooms across and you come across none other than Stretch from part 2. Stretch survived part 2, and for some reason she's in part 3 and she's chasing the ghost of Leatherface. She was specifically put in there. So there's a tie-in to part 2 and part 1 now that I've just pointed out. And not only that, but in part 2, we're introduced when Drayton is talking to Stretch, and he's talking to Leatherface and Chop Top, who's holding the dead body of Nubbins. Drayton mentions the phrase,
"The saw is family."
Now, clearly, this is a phrase that has been uttered and used throughout this family's history also. And the reason we know this is because Tinker gives Leatherface, in part 3, the chainsaw, the golden chrome chainsaw that we know as the Excalibur. He gives it to him, and braided into the saw is "the saw is family." Carved into the saw, beautifully, might I add. That's the reason I have not one but two of them. The saw is family, so it's almost like the family's quote, if you will. They say it all the time. They've used it for years. So that's your two tie-ins. Then we know that all the family gets butchered in part 3, except for Leatherface and the little girl. Okay, now stay with me here. This is where it gets really fun and pretty crazy. When we get to Texas Chainsaw Massacre 4, The Next Generation, originally dubbed The Return of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the movie was written and directed by the co-writer of the original film, Kim Hinkle. The family in this one, they are referred to as the Slaughters, just as they were referred to as the Slaughters in part 1. We're not dealing with the Sawyers anymore, but the Slaughters. Now, the leader of the family is Vilmer Slaughter. What does Vilmer Slaughter wear in part 4? He wears a mechanical knee brace on the right leg. So therefore, Leatherface from part 1 that injures his right leg is the same Leatherface in part 3 that's wearing a knee brace, and he turns out to be Vilmer in part 4. The reason this can actually make sense, go back to part 3, when Mama tells Leatherface to go do his lessons, or however she phrases it. Leatherface is literally getting smarter, and if you watch him in part 3, he's kind of assumed the patriarch role of the family at this point. He's not just the protector. It's almost like he's leading the family in part 3. He still isn't the face of the family, but he's leading the family, starting to like take that position. Like his brothers Tinker and Tex and Alfredo, they're still the faces of the family themselves. But Leatherface, he's learning, he's educating himself. Whatever mental illness he does have, he's learning and he's trying to educate himself. We see that when he's messing with the toy, and it's asking him what it is, and he says food, F-O-O-D, and says try again. So we see that he's learned. All right? It would make sense by the time we get to part 4 that Vilmer could be that character, because here's another reason. In the beginning of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, when it does the same thing that the previous 3 films did...
August 18th, 1973. News of a bizarre chainsaw-wielding family, reports which were to ignite the world's imagination, began to filter out of central Texas. Regrettably, not one of the family members was ever apprehended, and for more than 10 years, nothing further was heard. Then, over the next several years, at least 2 minor, yet apparently related incidents were reported. Then again, nothing. For 5 long years, silence.
Well, during that whole spiel, it acknowledges not just the first film, but the other 2 films, talking about how 2 minor yet related incidents happened. So it just acknowledged that the other 2 films happened along with the first film. So that means that the Slaughters and the Sawyers, they are connected, and this stuff is going on. Vilmer's Leatherface from part 1 and part 3. He's now the head of the family in part 4. And the reason he would be is he's gotten smarter, gotten better shape throughout this. And they're working for a worldwide secret government, the Illuminati, in part 4. So there's no reason he couldn't have the tools to help himself and to become, at the level, because he is crazy. And 2, it would explain, like, he would take over the family because he's watched for the past, at that point, 25 years? He's watched all members of his family, the Slaughters and the Sawyers, get murdered when he wasn't the head of the family. So over the previous 5 years after part 3, he's taken that mantle after losing members of the Sawyers, after losing members of the Slaughters. He's taken that mantle, along with having his brother W.E. Slaughter, and along with having his other brother, Leatherface, in that film. And that's another example. You take a look at the Leatherface in part 4, he is completely different than the Leatherface in the previous 3 films. So that goes back to the theory of how that can be one of their cousins, or in this case, it really is Velmer's brother, because he does refer to him as his brother in the movie. So there is still this idea of inbreeding going on, and they're working for a worldwide shadow government. And just look at how Leatherface in Part 2 and Part 4, they act different than each other. Those are 2 different guys. And we know Leatherface in Part 4 survives. So Leatherface in Part 2 is dead. And then Leatherface in Part 1 and 3, they're the same because they kind of act the same. And you see Leatherface advancing intellectually and just kind of evolving in Part 3. And then when we get to Part 4, he's Velmer, and he's had to take the reins for himself. But by the time we get to Part 4, so much crazy shit's happened and stuff, he's lost it. Like, he is going insane. If you want to connect, this is basically my entire Chainsaw theory for the first 4 films. So if you want to connect the first 4 films, that's it in a nutshell. Velmer from Part 4 is Leatherface from Part 3 and Part 1. Bubba, who dies at the end of Part 2, is a completely different Leatherface. And then Leatherface in Part 4 is a totally different Leatherface. And he is just another member of the Slaughters. And yeah, so, you know, anybody out there that's a big Chainsaw fanatic, if you actually made it through this video and heard everything I had to say, let me know if you agree with me or not. Let me know what your theory is, if you got one, and just tell me what you think. But either way, appreciate you guys just for listening and checking it out. And hopefully I'll have some more content like this coming up. So, freak it out.